Hello, everyone, and welcome to Autism Stories, where we connect you with amazing people that help autistic teens and adults become more independent and successful. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Research doesn't tell us much about the experiences of fathers whose children are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but especially for African American fathers. On this episode, we discuss this with Dr. Michael Hannon, who wrote his dissertation, Love Him and Everything Will Fall into Place, on this very important topic. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Dr. Hannon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
I wanted to start and learn, where does your story in the autism community begin?
Close to 15 years ago, I have two children. My daughter would be considered neurotypical, and she's a 17-year-old young lady in her senior year of high school. And my son is 15 years old, and he would be considered neurodiverse. He was diagnosed with pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, somewhere between 2005 and 2006, because he was 21 months at the time. And that was and I think it's safe to say my wife's first introduction to autism spectrum disorder. That's where it began for me and for us and our family.
So after your son's diagnosis, you went back to graduate school for a doctorate in counselor education and supervision. Why was that of such importance to you? Because at the time, from what I read about you, you had a job you really liked with great benefits.
Yeah, it was motivated by a few different reasons. The first was that I always had a professional goal to get a terminal degree. In my earlier aspirations, before my children, or at least certainly before Avery was born, Avery's my son, I envisioned myself being a vice president or a dean of student services or dean of student affairs in a 4-year college setting. I worked in student affairs, where you may be familiar, professionals who have helping skills background and programmatic skill background and training provide services for students on college campuses. So that could be anything that ranges from working in the financial aid office to academic advising to student activities and student leadership development. Aspire to get a terminal degree in higher education or higher education administration. Because of the way my career transpired and its trajectory, I transitioned into school counseling, and I was able to work with high school students in particular as a high school counselor. And that was really great because it blended my experience working in higher education, particularly with students of color, and helping them discover or rediscover and sharpen their leadership capacity. And then transitioning to school counseling, it married my interest, my professional interest, and my personal values in helping students on pathways to get college degrees. And I really fell in love with the school counseling role, working with K-12 students, particularly high school students. I was having a really good time professionally. It was personally fulfilling. And when we learned about Avery's diagnosed difference, it really began to raise questions for me about how autism in particular, but developmental differences more broadly, how they influence family systems. And because I was now working in a more explicitly clear counseling role as a school counselor, providing individual and small group short-term counseling for students in high school settings, working on college advising and career advising, I really began to be curious about how autism affected families. And I was watching it play out in my own house. My children are only 19 months apart. So when Avery didn't have expressive language, I think for quite some time, my daughter interpreted that as him not wanting to engage with her. We would have to field questions, we meaning my wife and me, we'd have to field questions like, how come he doesn't want to play with me? Or how come he doesn't like me? And us having to share with her in ways that were developmentally appropriate, that wasn't about her. That was about how he was different and how he just didn't have the words at that moment in his life. But over time, we hoped that he would be able to develop the words. And develop a clearer indication of his love for her that she could understand, if that makes sense. So once I became clear about those questions that I had, it changed my interest in terminal study. And I wanted to get a terminal counseling degree, so that I could help other families possibly, and develop a set of research skills that I could investigate it empirically to be able to hopefully provide the counseling community and allied mental health and behavioral health colleagues and professionals some insight about what happens with families.
Now, that led to you writing your dissertation on an analysis of narratives of African American fathers of children with autism spectrum disorders. I had not heard of such a dissertation before on this really important topic. Why did you decide to focus on this?
Yeah, I think it happened kind of organically. I went in to my doctoral studies after having worked for about 10 years. And so I was pretty clear about what I thought my dissertation would be. And, broadly, I'm assuming you have a pretty clear understanding about, the psychosocial aspects of autism, or the psychosocial aspects of disability, and how one person's diagnosed difference influences the other people in his or her life. So I walked into my doctoral studies thinking, I'm going to study like the sibling relationship and how this diagnosis influences sibling relationships and the sibling dynamic. Over the course of my studies, with the support of my committee and my family members and colleagues and friends and people who love us, it became clear to me that I was more curious about fathers' experiences. One, because of the natural tie to my own experience, and then I really began to realize that there wasn't a lot of published research about dads' experiences raising, loving, caring for their children with any forms of autism. And so my committee, my wife, and other loved ones were like, "Hey, Mike, this could be really valuable in helping people better understand dads' experiences with this, and particularly Black fathers, because while fathers in general were underrepresented in research, Black fathers were significantly less underrepresented in research." And so it was really like, forgive the euphemism, but it was kind of like a perfect storm that really justified me seeking answers to the questions I had.
Thinking about when you were doing this dissertation and research and all of that, and where we are today, where do you feel like things have changed in terms of research and information about African American fathers of those that are autistic?
Yeah, I think we've made some progress. I think the scientific community, the autism community in general, clinicians, therapists, advocates, parents, so we know more than we did, and I think that's important. But there's certainly much more to learn, and there are people who are doing great things that help inform what we know, or even what we think we know. And it's not solely by way of like empirical research. And is that important? It is. Empirical research is important, absolutely, because in the same way doctors refer to their professional journals, medical journals, to learn about the newest interventions, the newest discoveries, well, so do mental health and allied mental health professionals, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists. They go to their journals, and so being published in those journals help inform interventions and inform the knowledge base. But there's other things that take place in the communities where you and I live, where people are sharing what they know by way of their experience. So I'm thinking of a couple of examples. One, there's a major initiative in the state of Washington. There's a guy by the name of Greg Schell, and he started the Washington State Fathers Network, where he and colleagues of his were able to really launch an initiative that dads of kids with all kinds of differences, intellectual differences, cognitive differences, developmental differences, and began to really think long and hard about how do we best support dads in this experience. And so the Washington Father State Network is a great resource. The SIB support project, the Sibling Support Project, is a great resource that's born out of some of the work done in Washington, and Don Meyer in particular, along with Greg Schell, they've done some really great work in that regard, providing educational materials and advocacy work for siblings of people who have learning, developmental, cognitive differences. And then there's stuff like stuff that's like consumable by like a broader audience. Charles Jones created the documentary called Autistic Like Me, and he literally documented a retreat of men, of children with autism, engaging with each other, asking hard questions, being vulnerable, being honest and candid, and in some ways that are pretty rough to watch and listen to, but it's so valuable. So those things are accessible just by Googling Autistic Like Me or Googling Charles Jones. He's an awesome filmmaker. And then you have folks like Robert Nassif, who arguably is probably the leading voice in our country about the psychosocial aspects of autism on families, and particularly fathering children and individuals with autism. And he's got at least 2 books out that speak to this experience. And then you have like even more visible people like Rodney and Holly Peete, who Rodney Peete, the former NFL quarterback, wrote a book called Not My Son. And they have an adult child with autism now, but back then, RJ, which is their son's name, he was an adolescent and even pre-adolescent, and they were talking about their experiences, and they continue to be on the forefront of advocating for families and supporting families and funding projects. Doug Flutie, who runs the Doug Flutie Foundation. And so I use all these examples to say, is there research going on that's being published in journals? Absolutely, and that's important. But there are other resources that are accessible to people who may not be inclined to dig into a peer-reviewed medical or counseling journal, where they can find like really relevant information. And then, everybody, all of us who are affected by this experience, we have our own ways of sharing our story, whether it's creating our own small nonprofit organizations or doing community-based work, hosting conferences and meetings and things like that, where we're sharing and learning from one another to better support each other and the children who deserve our love and care.
An important question you asked from your dissertation was, how do African American men describe their fathering experiences as fathers of children with autism spectrum disorders? How did you go about collecting data for this essential question?
Yeah, so I'm going to spill out the nerd in me, so hold tight. How did I go about it? Well, depending on your knowledge and comfort with research methods, I wanted to do a qualitative study as opposed to a quantitative study or a mixed method study. And qualitative studies are usually designed largely to investigate a topic in depth. What I wanted to do, I wanted to use a research design that allowed these men to tell their stories. And the research design I used was basically a narrative analysis. So I essentially went to these men. I interviewed them 3 times apiece. There were 6 guys, 6 black fathers, black American fathers, and I interviewed them 3 times apiece. So I had literally had 18 interviews worth of data, asking them about their stories, asking them to recall and recant stories. And what I attempted to do was to take all of those individual stories from the 6 different men over 3 interviews and do my best to create one coherent narrative about their experience. And so each of those guys had a separate chapter in my dissertation, individually recalling their stories, my interpretation of them, and then me confirming that I understood what they were saying and they agreed with what I shared, but also a more summative kind of account of what this experience was like and has been for them as men. So there's an issue of gender in there. We're certainly looking at issues of ability status, because we're talking about their children who were diagnosed with autism, and sometimes they had multiple diagnoses. And then, so there's a dimension of ability status, and then lastly, there's certainly an issue of race in there, and paying attention to if and how race influences their broader experiences. And so, it was my intent to really just hear what they had to say, interpret it in a way that was accurate, and then convey it in a way that gave their individual accounts a more comprehensive account. Yeah.
And one question you asked during your interviews was how the fathers have helped others understand their child's diagnosis. What type of responses did you get from them?
What I would say is there tends to be some assessment of risk in sharing, and one, in being present in a range of spaces. So what I mean by that is these guys have to determine where they want to be with their children who may be affected by autism, and how welcoming or not those spaces might be depending on who's there. And so them assessing the safety of those spaces and what kinds of responses they anticipated receiving if and when their children's symptoms would emerge and people might not be knowledgeable or empathic about what they saw. So there's certainly almost like a risk assessment that takes place, and determining who's safe and what spaces are safe and what places aren't safe. And a lot of that is determined by prior knowledge. Like if I'm going to a space where if they're taking their kids to other spaces where there might be children who have learning differences or developmental differences, the risk might not be as great. But if they're going to spaces where they've been invited and they don't know a lot of people, but it's a family event, and they wrestle with, hey, do we take the children? Do we don't take the children? Do we not take the children? And being ready to be one, inundated with questions, possibly. Hey, what's up with your kid? Hey, your son or your daughter seems a little different. Like those kinds of questions, even if they're genuine and sincere, to being explicitly stigmatized with language like, hey, we can't accommodate that, or hey, your child's being a disruption right now in the midst of this particular program or event. And so the risk assessment was a big deal depending on who was going to be there and who wasn't. The other kind of response I got certainly acknowledged the kind of influence they had in those spaces. So even if I was going to a space where, or if any of these guys were going to spaces where they didn't have current relationships with people, or people who knew them and knew the reputation that they had possibly in the community. So there were guys in my dissertation, these volunteers, some of them were visible business leaders in their community, or just general leaders in their community. They had family who taught in the school districts where their children went to school for years, literally generations. And so that kind of capital and influence sometimes shielded them from the kind of responses that they might get otherwise if people didn't know who they were or didn't know the context of their family. And so the responses ranged, but certainly they were acutely aware of where they were going, who was going to be there, and who would be sensitive enough to respond with compassion if and when their children's symptoms may be misunderstood.
Did the fathers give you any indication if they felt more isolated from the community, kept more to themselves and their children at home because of the responses they would get?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I'm learning and continuing to learn as I go through my own experience and then try to engage with other fathers of individuals with autism, I found in my dissertation and in subsequent work that I've done, it can be a very isolating experience. And I think that's fairly generalizable among all parents and caregivers of people with autism, that they feel isolated because if your friend group and your social group, if they have neurotypical children, then there's not really much to connect. There may not be as much to connect on. There may not be as many connection points, particularly as you're talking about fathering and raising your kids and what might be considered typical benchmarks of development and progress. So it could be fairly isolating. So yeah, there were stories and recollections of them saying, hey, you know what, that's not quite the space I want to go to, or hey, I don't feel like I'm not up to the challenge of having to describe and detail how and why my kid may be different from the other kids that are in the space. Things as simple as going to the playground or deciding not to go to the local playground, to not wanting to go to well doctor visits, possibly because for fear of hearing what might be considered more devastating or news or prognoses that are hard to make sense of. And so, yeah, there were certainly times when these guys decide, hey, I'm gonna tap out in this moment, or I'm gonna refrain from engaging in this particular moment because of the demands, mm-hmm. and because I feel isolated.
And did they have some words of wisdoms to other fathers whose child was maybe just being diagnosed with autism?
Yeah, they certainly did. I think the most consistent message that I heard, and I'm doing my best to kind of summarize, was it's to consider and really take note of the kinds of capital or resources that you have. What I've learned over the course of several years in interviewing dads and kids with autism, particularly dads of color, is it's important to know the kind of resources you have at your disposal. And so for folks who are, for dads, black fathers, Latino fathers, and white fathers who are getting the initial diagnosis, it's try to be present and in the moment, even though it's hard not to think about the future and what the future may hold for their children and for their family as a result of this diagnosis, but to also take stock of the kind of resources you have at your disposal. And those resources or that capital comes in a number of ways, whether it's monetarily, hey, do I have a good job that can pay for therapeutic services over the course of my kid's life? It could be resources by way of like social capital. Who's in my network? Who do I know? Even though I may not be a doctor, do I know doctors? Do I know school leaders? Do I know therapists and things like that? And certainly like another form of influence is cultural capital. You know, can I go into a school and speak the language of school professionals so that I'm not marginalized as a result of not knowing what an IEP stands for, or a 504 plan stands for, or multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. You know, these are the kinds of things that in the community, particularly of therapeutic professionals, we and other folks talk like that and use that kind of language. And we may not be as in tune to what our parents and caregivers know and don't know with that language. And so fathers are really taking into account what kind of resources that they have. And these guys talked about taking account of the resources that they have in order to position themselves and their children for as high a quality of life as possible. And the other thing that I think it's safe to say that they shared was it's absolutely critical that you find community, however that comes. If that means going to a support group, cool. If that means connecting with other folks in your child's school district who you know share similar identities, you know, these are all teenagers who have autism, and the symptoms present themselves in a variety of ways. But listen, you know what it's like to have your kid having a reaction to being overstimulated by way of his sensory needs or her sensory needs. So finding community, usually with other men who have the same or have a similar lived or shared experience, becomes critical, because then you don't feel like you're on an island. Then you don't feel isolated, and you can ask the questions that you want to ask other people with some confidence that they can address some of your concerns and give you some tips and pointers as you move across the lifespan. It's one thing to have a young child with autism and what may be what you might expect during that time versus adolescence going through puberty to transitioning to adulthood, and depending on the severity of symptoms, does the child or can the child hold down a job successfully? Being able to broach those questions with people with more or less experience, it becomes a lifeline. And those are some of the things that I remember them sharing, and some of the things, quite frankly, that I've heard even more recently as I engage with fathers of individuals with autism.
Yeah, we all need community, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And did the fathers think that their experience changed being that they were fathers of color?
Yes, for a couple different reasons. I think what the guys in my dissertation talked about was, I think the loudest message I heard was about trust. Unfortunately, in our country, while there are awesome service providers, hospitals, therapists, behavioral professionals, mental health professionals, we can't. We have to acknowledge how and why people who have been marginalized, namely people of color and Black folks in our country, how and why they may be resistant to following the advice or trusting with a full heart the recommendations, the assessments and opinions of service providers, because there still seem to be great disparities in quality of care and access to care. And so in the back of many of the minds of the guys who participated in my dissertation, they would question, hey, am I getting the same quality of service that another family would get in here if they were white? Because in most cases, their service providers were white people, great folks who might be providing an awesome scope of services. But the question was persistent, like, hey, can I trust this? Can I trust this teacher? Can I trust this developmental pediatrician? Am I getting the full suite and complement of services that I'm entitled to? Are there assumptions made about my child who's on the autism spectrum, or my family, because maybe I'm not in a marital relationship with the mother of my child, and people have ideas and biases about married couples versus non-married couples, and there are stereotypes about absentee Black fathers that continue to persist, even though data and evidence tell us that that's not the case. So the difference for the Black fathers, in part, maybe not in total, but in part, was, can I trust that I'm getting high quality, genuine service from the people who are signed and are ethically bound to provide me and my family with high quality service? So.
And what about the types of support that they thought were most successful for their children?
The types of support that seemed to be most helpful for them was, again, I'll go back to kind of finding community. It's hard. It's hard as a dad, period, right? It's hard as a dad. And I say that as genuinely as I can say it, knowing that men have all kinds of privileges in our world and in our country. But it's hard as a dad when dads make really intentional decisions to be engaged in the care of their children beyond just being a financial provider. Like, fathering looks very differently than it did a generation ago and 2 generations ago, where men and dads are creating the kinds of experiences that they want so that it allows them to be more deeply engaged in their children's care. So there are a number of more stay-at-home dads than there ever been in our country's history, and men are creating these opportunities where they can be more involved. But in doing so, if and when they decide to seek support, when they do seek support, many times those supports are largely attended by women, moms. And so for them to be able to find another dad who shares an experience, and then for them to be able to find another dad of color or a Black father who shares an experience, who might be, their children may be in the racial minority in the schools where they attend, or where their children attend, or even if they are in the numerical majority, many times still the teachers, the service providers, they still may be people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, primarily white service providers and teachers and things like that. So to find another person who has a shared experience by way of ability status of their children, and potentially a racial or ethnic shared experience based on that identity, it's like I said, it's like a lifeline. There's a hope that those dads can be much more honest, much more transparent in their own experiences, which provides them the opportunity to get the kind of feedback necessary to continue to learn to be the right kind of help for their families and their children. Finding communities is what I would say with respect to the kinds of support that have been most helpful, particularly from other dads who might be Black or of color.
Were there places where they found those people in the community?
It's interesting. if and when they would take the risk of going to seek help, they might find them in support groups or connection groups, but not as frequently. All of the men in my study, in my dissertation, they all identified as Christian men. And so their faith and worship community provided a form of support that, even though people in their faith community may not have had the same shared lived experience, there was another connection point by way of their faith, which helped develop and sharpen their outlook, have a more positive outlook, and really believe by faith that things would get better. And even if they didn't get better for themselves or their children, that they had what it took. Their faith gave them what it took for them to be successful and to be a good dad and a good partner and a good family member. So I think those were the places where they found a fair amount of support in their faith communities, if and when they found dads groups. The thing about dads groups is, what I've learned is, sometimes, depending on who is sponsoring them, they can be inconsistent. So you have a couple with some consistency, and then they fall off, and then they never catch traction. And so being able to engage with their faith community, sometimes with other dads, if that was available, if that was a consistent form of support. And the other thing I would say is, these guys in my study relied heavily on their wives. So these were all straight black men who were married to the biological mothers of their children. And so they relied heavily on the support that came from their wives to help them navigate, help them reconcile some of the challenges that they were facing, whether that's, they're feeling guilty, whether they were feeling pessimistic, that their wives were a huge source of support in that moment.
Now, personally for you, was there one or two takeaways from your dissertation that really stood out to you?
Yeah, I'll try to say this as concisely as possible. I think a couple things come to mind. One, we have to continue. We as dads, and then those of us who are in positions to help families living with autism, particularly families of color. But I think there's some generalizability across racial and ethnic lines. To the extent we can, we have to work hard to maintain a strengths-based perspective that even though symptoms may be severe, and even though what a dad may have expected in the relationship with his unborn son or daughter during pregnancy, and then learning about the diagnosis and what that might mean for that child moving forward, that there are still strengths and assets that our children living with autism have. And so I say that as humbly as I can, because I know that there are people who have children who aren't as affected. Their symptoms are mild, and they sometimes present as neurotypical, depending on who's paying attention. But to maintain kind of a strengths-based perspective, a strength-based orientation, and to think about the rewards that come as a result. All these guys talked about how their fathering experiences have been personally transformational. They never would have believed that they could be as patient as they have become as a result of raising children with autism. They never would have believed that they would have valued things as simple as their children smiling during a selfie picture, right? The things that we might take absolutely for granted, those things come as a result of having a strength-based kind of perspective to say, listen, even though things may not be what I anticipated, there's still some reward and some value in my lived experience raising, loving, and caring for a person who's on the autism spectrum. The other thing I would say as a takeaway was to continue to assess that capital that you have. Who's in your network? Who do you know? Who loves you unconditionally? Who can you go to for support? Who will listen to you without judgment? What kind of healthcare benefits do you have? Who in your community might be able to give you a good recommendation for a really well-endorsed developmental pediatrician? So thinking about who's in the network so that you can leverage those networks for your care as dad and for the care of your children who might be living on the spectrum. And then, of course, Doug, as a counselor, I'm always going to say one takeaway for me is I can't underscore enough the value of professional counseling and mental health services. people do not have to be in crisis in order to seek mental health support. So for the guys and for men that I engage with even now, there's always value in going, if accessible, there's always value in going to see and talk to a professional who is knowledgeable about helping people set goals, attain goals, and if there are barriers to those goals, whether they be because of an acute circumstance or because there may be a diagnosis, counseling and mental health support is critical. And there's more and more evidence that we see just by virtue of the socio-political climate in which we live, that counseling and mental health support can only be helpful, can largely be helpful. It can be detrimental depending on the kind of therapist that you see, and if that person is able to help you reach your goals. But in large part, it can really be helpful in having a balanced perspective, to taking things one day at a time, and fighting the urge to become, fighting or resisting the potential to be overwhelmed when you think about the future, and kind of taking one day at a time. Like, those are the kinds of things that if folks have trouble doing, counselors can be of a great help and great resource. So those are some of the takeaways that come to mind for me.
And your dissertation, you completed it in 2013. If you had to do your dissertation all over again, what have you learned since then that would add some value to it?
Oh, man. I continue to be acutely aware of some of the things I said before. So I'll give you an example. Robert Nassif and I, who lives in the Philadelphia region, and I live in the Philly region as well, we're running a dad's group right now. We started in September, and we'll have our third meeting next weekend. And at the last meeting we had, the tenor of the space was very angry. So the guys were kind of just sharing their stories, what's happened since the last meeting, how you doing, just kind of doing a check-in. And the anger was so palpable because guys were talking about essentially being hurt, their children not having expressive language and not being able to communicate "I love you," right? And some of those dads wanting to hear "I love you" from their children, right? And that's hard. And as people were talking about their anger, Robert and I did our best to acknowledge it and let them express it, and then we challenged them to say, "So what's happened over the last month that's been rewarding? What can you recall between the last time we met and that day that made you smile, that gave you a sense of warmth and accomplishment and fulfillment based on your relationship with your children?" And these guys started just kind of shouting and sharing all of these awesome moments that they have with their children. And so the example where I said that the son smiled during a selfie, that was one of them. And laughing about one dad's son whose logic was so clear that it made them laugh because somebody in the house said, "Hey, I got to jump in the shower," and the child who's on the autism spectrum said, "Hey, you better not jump in the shower or you might slip," right? But that's an appropriate and logical response to what we consider as, it's a euphemism, but it was so funny to them that it just gave them a sense of joy that their child was engaging with them in a socially appropriate way when they don't get those moments all the time. And so what have I learned since then is to do our best to acknowledge the rewards and the strengths, the rewards that come as a result of fathering, and the strengths that we possess as a result of fathering, and doing our best to find community so that we're not isolated. Dads, Black fathers, and fathers from other racial and ethnic groups, we seem to pay very particular attention to how we can provide for our children, and the provision. And while we know this, sometimes it's just as valuable to hear it. The provision is not solely financial. Do I have a good job with good benefits that can take care of my kids? Yes. Do I have a good retirement plan? Do I have an executed will that in the event that something goes down, my kids will be taken care of? Absolutely. Those are all critical things for dads and Black fathers in particular. But there's also the emotional provision. I'm here. I'm present. I'm accessible. I'm working through these challenges. I'm celebrating these wins, whether they be big wins or whether they be small wins, whether people perceive them to be big wins or whether people perceive them to be nothing significant. The emotional provision that these guys can provide and the opportunities that they have is, I don't even know if it's measurable, right? Like it's something that we can't quantify because it's so rich and it's so valuable that to bypass it, we're doing ourselves a disservice. Dads are doing themselves a disservice if and when they can't get over some of the challenges and really consider how they personally get transformed and how they become better people as a result of the experience.
Thinking about the support for their children, but I also think about the support for themselves, and self-care is so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
How the fathers talk about how they took care of themselves and currently continue to do so.
Self-care is it's really relative to everybody's style. So I think one of the tasks are for all of us, whether we're raising neurotypical children or neurodiverse children. The task for self-care is to find activities that feed our souls and make us feel good, that are healthy. One father I remember very explicitly talking about how he walked every morning. It gave him a sense of calm, a sense of balance. It gave him a sense of control, albeit limited, that he could in some way kind of steer and direct the course of his day or days. Sometimes going away, having family and friends who might be willing to step in and care for their children, and being able to then steal away for a weekend or a day or two for a little solace and respite. Those were things that they talked about. They certainly talked about their spiritual lives and how their faith fed their soul, quite frankly. And so those were some of the more frequent responses to taking care of themselves. I mean, they mentioned working hard to find ways to nurture and invest in their marital relationships so that conversations and priorities were not solely their children who were on the spectrum. They talked about, particularly dads who had more than one child, making sure they were investing in the relationships that they had with their other children, because many report, and there's research to suggest that siblings of children with autism and other differences, they feel like their parents aren't as present and accessible because of their siblings' needs. And so those few things I'm remembering stood out to these guys when it was related to their self-care.
And for those that are listening that want to read your dissertation, how do they go about doing so?
Oh, well, they can, I think there's a few different ways. One, they can always email me at my work email address, where they can always email me at my work address at Hannon, HANNONMI, at montclair.edu. I'm a faculty member at Montclair State University in New Jersey. But if they did a search, my dissertation title was called "Love Him and Everything Else Will Fall into Place," which was a quote directly taken from one of the fathers. And so if they just did a search for Michael Hannon dissertation or "Love Him and Everything Will Fall into Place," or if they did a general search for African American fathers of children or individuals with autism, there's not a lot. I don't think there's even now in 2019, there's not a lot about Black fathers of kids with autism. And so those kinds of general searches could probably yield my dissertation. But certainly emailing me is just as if not more effective.
And I'm just wondering, because your message is so important, do you ever do any public speaking or talk at conferences on this topic?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm fortunate in that for some audiences and for some folks, professional organizations, they find value in some of the stuff that I'm doing and learning. And so yeah, I present and keynote with some frequency, and get invitations like this to be on podcasts like yours. Robert Nassif and I are going to be featured on a podcast. I think it's going to air tomorrow from Autism Speaks about fathering and autism. So certainly do that, and I'm happy to determine if invitations come. Happy to try to determine if there's a fit and if I can meet the need, and if so, yeah, happy to jump in and contribute. So I do get those opportunities with some frequency.
Well, Dr. Hannon, I really appreciated your time, and thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
Hey, Doug, I appreciate your time, too. I did some homework, of course, after getting your invitation, and it's admirable and necessary, the work that you're doing in providing personal coaching service for individuals with autism and supporting their families. So kudos to you and the work that you're doing, and if there's opportunities for us to collaborate moving forward, I look forward to it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode, and thank you so much to Dr. Hannon for the conversation. I really appreciated him touching on the importance of community, because that is a cornerstone of the work of Autism Personal Coach. We all need community. Modern life can be challenging for anyone. When you're autistic, the world isn't designed with your unique traits in mind, and everyday demands can feel insurmountable. At Autism Personal Coach, we celebrate neurodiversity by empowering adults and teens to be the best version of their authentic selves. The people we serve are the real experts. We're here to help your goals become a reality. To get an Autism Personal Coach for a loved one or yourself, all you have to do is email autismpersonalcoach@yahoo.com or call 216-336-5889 and request a coach today. On the next episode of Autism Stories, we will talk with Dr. Sarah Zait on helping to make medical appointments more productive for autistic people. Talk to you then.
Sometimes we wish we were normal. We hope you understand. This is not fun at all. There are some times we fear we can't improve. Everyone around us has said that we've improved. Taking longer to study, longer to learn. It also takes us longer to complete